Hey, what's happening, guys? Welcome to Triumphs of History and Fantasy. To start things off, we're going to be doing a book review of 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed by Eric Klein. We'll probably be kicking off the channel with a bunch of history book reviews first, largely because you guys really don't want to see my fantasy and fiction book collection just yet. I know, terrifying, right? I literally started 2018 with one book. One. The Complete Chronicles of Conan. And as good as Conan is, I think it'll be pretty fun to watch the collection grow from nothing, see what it does from there. And back to 1177 BC. Basically, a friend asked me my opinion of the book, and I hadn't read it yet. So I picked it up, and it's the first book I read in 2018, so here's the review. The book 1177 BC is all about the late Bronze Age collapse. And for those of you who don't know, in the late 12th century BCE, some series of events caused the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Kassites in Babylon, New Kingdom Egypt, and the Mycenaeans, among others, to basically fall apart. And when I say fall apart, I mean their civilization basically ended. The only exception being New Kingdom Egypt, which technically, while the Egyptian culture didn't end, it was certainly humbled and laid low. The book's main purpose is to figure out what caused this collapse, and to also re-examine the previously held thesis that the Sea Peoples, which we still don't know that much about, basically came in and caused enough chaos that all the civilizations collapsed. Unfortunately, only the last 2 or so chapters of the book actually deal with this issue, which was unfortunate. The majority of the book was actually dedicated to the history and economics of the late Bronze Age, from roughly the 15th through the 12th centuries, and I felt that was actually really well done. The author used old research and some actually new contemporary finds, which was quite refreshing. And he also did a great job combining primary source material from the ancient texts themselves along with modern archaeology. I appreciate that the author took the time to examine a bunch of the Near Eastern civilizations during this time period, especially the Hittites. My favorite, probably ancient Near Eastern peoples. Usually they get kind of glossed over, especially in favor of more well-known cultures such as the Egyptians. Be that as it may, the author's own answer to the question of the late Bronze Age collapse in the Near East was completely underwhelming. The author basically does a rundown of all the potential causes of the collapse, and it goes a little something like this. While there were earthquakes alone were not enough to cause the collapse. Climate change. Even though there was climate change alone was not enough to cause the collapse. Even though there were droughts alone were probably not enough to cause the collapse. With the droughts there was probably famine, but famine alone was probably not enough to cause the collapse. There is not enough evidence for internal rebellions to prove that they caused the collapse. International trade was still flourishing right before the collapse, so it's unlikely that a breakdown of international trade caused the collapse. The rise of a merchant class was unlikely to have caused the collapse. The Sea Peoples alone were unlikely to have caused the late Bronze Age collapse. And you can probably see where this is heading. I mean, obviously not one of these things is probably enough to collapse all the civilizations of the Near East, but some sort of mixture or combination of them. And this is exactly where the author takes it, where the factors, quote, could have combined to produce a scenario in which the repercussions of each factor were magnified, in what some scholars have called a multiplier effect. The failure of one part of the system might also have a domino effect, leading to failures elsewhere. The ensuing systems collapse could have led to the disintegration of one society after another, in part because of the fragmentation of the global economy and the breakdown of the interconnections upon which each civilization was dependent. The author then combines the systems collapse idea with complexity theory, basically stating that these late Bronze Age civilizations had become so complex that it wouldn't take much to throw everything out of whack if something were to nudge the system in any meaningful way. At least the author himself does admit that this is sort of a wishy-washy answer, and to quote, "It sounds nice, but does it really advance our understanding? Is it more than just a fancy way to state a fairly obvious fact, namely, that complicated things can break down in a variety of ways?" And with that statement, the author sums it up quite nicely. Basically, a deadly concoction of factors, all just merged together at the wrong time to spell the end of the late Bronze Age. One thing I can't complain about is the author's superb use of footnotes. I mean, literally hundreds of footnotes in this book. This included old literature, new articles, and even things like notes on the translation that he used. The bibliography is also superb, though I do wish the author had somehow annotated it a little bit. I mean, it's literally 28 pages of resources. If he could have just gave, what some of the more useful ones were to start off with, might have been a little bit helpful. Overall, I'm going to give 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed, a 6 out of 10. A little lackluster on the collapse part, but definitely had some redeeming qualities in basically being a great survey of the late Bronze Age as a whole. Well, thanks for watching my first book review, guys. Hopefully it wasn't too cringeworthy. Also, if you have any fantasy book recommendations, I'd love to hear from them. I'd love to jump into it, but I literally have no idea where to start. Until next time, read victoriously.